My name is Amelia Klem Osterud. I am a librarian and a historian, and I research tattooed ladies of the circus, the history of tattooed ladies of the circus. And a number of years ago, I wrote a book called The Tattooed Lady, A History, which is all about the history of working tattooed women in the circus and sideshow, specifically American tattooed women. I don't really delve into European tattooed performers. And I just want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite tattooed ladies, a woman named Irene Woodward, who was one of the first two tattooed ladies to perform in the United States. She started working in 1882. She was one of two women. The other woman was named Nora Hildebrand. And in March and April of 1882, they had a press battle in the New York press where they essentially vied to capture the title of first tattooed lady ever, which is really quite charming. And Irene is a favorite of mine for a number of reasons. She was, by all pictures showing, she was a beautiful, beautiful woman. People who worked with her had wonderful things to say about her. And she was also, I think, like many of these women, she was a feminist. She did not speak as a feminist. She didn't outwardly work as a but she was an independent woman who was self-employed as a performer and as a really unusual performer in the 1880s and 1890s. And she came from a very, very impoverished background. She was born in Philadelphia in 1857, and her name was not Irene Woodward. Most of these women had fake names. Her name was Ida Lisk, and she was the daughter of a shoemaker who was a Civil War veteran, and her mother, a housewife. She had one brother who survived to adulthood, but she had 5 siblings die at birth, essentially, and the last one lived for about a month, died, and then a week later her mother died, and she was a young teenager. And so then essentially she was left alone as the woman of the house, as that would have been in the early 1870s, to essentially take care of the house, take care of her brother, and take care of her father. It sort of paints a picture of a pretty tragic upbringing for her. She met a young man named George. They got married. His name was George Sterling. They moved to Chicago. Somewhere in there she got tattooed. I don't actually have a record, as many of these people don't, of who tattooed her and when and where, but it was sometime between 1880 and 1882. There are a few sources that say that she was tattooed by Martin Hildebrand, who was a very famous tattooist in New York. He showed up in the New York Times from time to time, granting interviews about tattooing. He was sort of a bigwig. His wife/girlfriend/partner was Nora Hildebrand. So it's possible she was tattooed by him in New York before she got started in 1882. Don't really know. It's one of those things we don't know. So in the process of her transforming herself into a performer in between 1880 and 1882, she changed her name to Irene Woodward. Not really sure where that came from, but she liked it. She needed a performance name. The really interesting thing is her husband, George Sterling, also changed his last name to Woodward. So I don't know if it was either a joint choice. Oftentimes when you see them listed when they were both working, he was still listed as George Sterling. Sometimes he was listed as George Woodward. And so you also sort of get a sense of Woodward at that point between the two of them was the more well-known name, which again, for a woman in the 1880s to have a more famous name that her husband is willing to take, that to me is really, really interesting. It means to me that she was clearly the breadwinner in the family, and obviously he was a theatrical agent and a booking agent. She would have made a better income than him as a performing sideshow freak. Irene and George had a son early in her career. His name was also George. He grew up to be a theatrical worker as well. And Irene really spent the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s working consistently. So she worked in dime museums in the wintertime. She worked for Four Paws Circus for a number of seasons. Both she and her husband, they would often work the same show. He would be either a show manager or a gate agent, and she would be performing in the sideshow. And she would, like I said, she worked on four-part shows for a couple of years. She worked in dime museums in the wintertime. At some point she got hired, I think it was 1889, she got hired for Barnum's London Circus. So they went to Europe with Barnum. And evidently they really liked Europe, because they then went back and forth to Europe. They did long stretches of working in Europe after that. So she spent most of the 1890s working in Europe, in museums and shows in Europe. I have a couple of passport applications that she and her husband took out. If you were an American citizen in that time period, there were not like physical passports that you carried with you. What you did is, if you were traveling, you went to the embassy in the city and you essentially applied for a paper passport. And so they would write, where they had been, where their home address was, all their biographical detail. Hers, of course, they have a physical description because there are no photographs on these at this point. Where it says body, it always says body tattooed. They're very, very charming. But those also provide some clues about her background and where she was living and what her marital status was, and her child was always included in these. And so you get sort of the private view of Irene Woodward as a wife and a mother, in addition to the public view of her as a very public, very famous performer. She was loved in Europe. There were apparently multiple wax figures of her in multiple wax museums in various cities. She worked for Pawnee Bill's show for a couple of years. They toured Europe, and so she worked on that show for a few years. And so she and her husband sort of bounced back and forth a little bit between the United States and Europe. And she finally retired around 1910-ish and moved back to Philadelphia, where they were both originally from. Unfortunately, she died in 1915. She wasn't that old. And she died of uterine cancer, which, as you can imagine, in 1915 there is no treatment for. Essentially there was nothing they could do. Of course, because she was still fairly famous, her cancer made the paper in Philadelphia. And as wacky circus newspaper coverage goes, of course the headlines were, "The tattoo ink has given her cancer, and now she is dying because she was a tattooed woman," which of course is not true. But you've sort of got to, she was someone who was very lovely and worked clearly very hard in a very unique and difficult industry, and then had probably a really terrible death, which is very, very sad in a time when there was nothing they could absolutely do. So I'm pretty sure where she's buried. She has no headstone. She's fairly anonymous, in an unmarked grave in a cemetery outside of Philadelphia. So it's sort of a sad end to a really wonderful, wonderful human. It's an interesting story to sort of see it from. She was clearly a very modern woman to have the idea in the 1880s that she could get fully tattooed and go on stage in an era when women did not go on stage generally on their own, which is essentially what she did. And she worked very, very successfully throughout her life in that profession. But it was also still 75, 100 years ago. And the things that happened to her were clearly indicative of the time that she lived in. So, yeah, so that's Irene Woodward.